Looking back over more than 40 years, I was then a great lover of liberty, as well as health and happiness, and I possessed a great desire to see a new country never trod by civilized man, so that I easily caught the gold fever of 1849, and naught but a trip to that land of fabled wealth could cure me. We took off our hats, and then, overlooking the scene of so much trial, suffering, and death, spoke the thought uppermost, saying, "Goodbye, Death Valley." William Lewis Manley.
Westerns. America loves them. And as you can see, I've been in a whole bunch of them. Those stories were about the Old West and the strength and character of the pioneers who settled it. The explorers, the Indians, the cavalry, from the trailblazers to the wagon trains to the railroads, America has a fascinating story to tell. A lot of the Westerns I was in were fiction. Most had some sort of historical base, but they were still fiction. Well, that's all right, because that's just how Hollywood movies are made. When it comes to real life, though, I've always liked the plain, unvarnished truth. So, here's a real Western for you. This show is about real people who in 1849, after wandering into a nameless, dry, sun-baked, and desolate valley, finally created their own trail of escape. This is the true story of how Death Valley got its name. This show is also about the real people who recently retraced a portion of what has become known as the Death Valley Escape Trail.
I'm going down in Death Valley, on the tombstones and dry bones. I'm going down in Death Valley, on the tombstones and dry bones. I'm like a sheep out on the fold. Don't you know I'm dying all alone? Oh, yes, I am. Death Valley gonna be my home.
Until gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill on the American River in Northern California, only the strongest and most able-bodied men had challenged the elements of America's West. But in December of 1848, 10 months after the discovery, President James K. Polk spoke of this newfound wealth in a speech to Congress, and the gold rush of 1849 was officially on. In this 1 year, over 25,000 travelers moved along the Oregon Trail and other routes leading west. Our story is about one such group who, after arriving in Salt Lake City, too late to chance a northern crossing of the Sierra Nevadas, first joined a larger group of wagons headed south, but then, following a new map, attempted a shortcut to the gold fields across an unexplored region. After great difficulties, they arrived at the present-day Furnace Creek in Death Valley. 2 days after Christmas in 1849, their duel with Death Valley had just begun.
Captain Hunt and what became known as the Hunt wagon train had left Salt Lake City. There was about 400 or 500 people traveling with them and about 100 wagons. They were on the old Spanish Trail. That was considered to be the safe route that late in the season. when they were overtaken on the trail by a group of trappers that had a map with them drawn by Barney Ward. Now, Barney Ward was a trapper himself, and he was known in the area. The map showed a shortcut to the gold field. Well, nothing could be better news for most of these folks who that's the reason they were traveling west anyway, was to reach the gold fields. The map showed a shortcut through a pass called Walker Pass. The problem was, by today's standards, the map was completely inadequate. It didn't show a number of important features, including a number of mountain ranges. All but about 6 wagons decided to follow the map and try this new trail. The going was very difficult. Within a week or so, all but just a few people had turned back and rejoined Captain Hunt. But as it is in life, there's always those people who have such a pioneer spirit, and they're just not going to be denied. They feel like they've made a decision, and they're going to see it all the way to the end. And so there were a number of people who just kept pressing west, even through all the difficulties. In this group was the Bennett and Arcan families, which had traveling with them William Lewis Manley and John Rogers. There were a number of other groups in this party also, now famous in Gold Rush era history. The Sandwalkers, the Mississippi Boys, the Briar Mess with Reverend Briar, the Jayhawkers, all of these groups, and that's pretty much what they were now. They were groups. Instead of being a defined wagon train that was under a common leadership, it's an interesting phenomenon that happens sometimes with people. The more difficult the circumstances are, the more people begin to rely on themselves rather than relying on the collective power of a group. These groups became more and more splintered and more defined as units to themselves, so that when they arrived in present-day Death Valley in December of 1849, they were pretty much all splintered and separated into groups. All of the groups except the Bennett and Arcan family decided that the only way out was to walk out. They couldn't get through the Panamints with their wagons, and so they burned their wagons. The Jayhawkers, the Sandwalkers, all of these groups burned their wagons and went over the Panamints by foot. The Bennett and Arcan family, with still the Wade family and Richard Culverwell, an elderly gentleman, and William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, they turned south in the valley. They were determined that they were going to find a way out with their wagons.
Bennett and Arcan now concluded not to wait for me to go ahead and explore out a way for them to follow, as I had done for a long time, but to go ahead, as it was evidently the best way to turn south and make our own road and find the water and passes for ourselves. There was no possible way to cross this high, steep range of mountains anywhere to the north, and the Jayhawkers had abandoned their wagons and burned them, and we could no longer follow on the trail they made. It seemed that there was no alternative but for us to keep along the edge of the mountains to the south and search for another pass. William Lewis Manley.
The group struggles on, reaching a small sulfur water hole south of Bennett's Well. From this small spring, a 2-day effort is made to cross the Panamint Mountains to the west. When this attempt fails, fear begins to grip the families. They're in a desperate situation. They resist leaving their wagons. They have several small children, and Mrs. Arcan is now 5 months pregnant. They retreat from the failed crossing back to the water hole to make camp and talk about how to escape this valley. It is January the 14th, 1850, and what happened next is what a group of hikers set out to experience: an escape from Death Valley.
The decision the Bennett and Arcan families needed to make was what to do. Should they abandon their wagons as the others had and try to leave on foot? Or should they do something else? They decided that they would ask John Rogers and William Lewis Manley to go ahead for provisions and to scout the trail. They agreed that if they didn't return within 10 or 15 days, that different stories tell it different ways, but it's about 10 or 15 days, that if they didn't return, that the families were to assume that they had failed to make it out, and the families should then try to leave on their own. They also wrongly supposed that just over the mountain range that was staring them in the face, which we know today as the Panamints, they wrongly supposed that those were the Sierra Nevadas and that just over that mountain range was Los Angeles. So that's why they thought it would only take 10, 15 days for them to go and return. Well, it turned out to be 250 miles, not 50. It turned out to take 26 days, not 10 or 15. But when Manley and Rogers did return, they found the Bennett and Arcan family still there waiting. But it was a life and death situation. The Bennett and Arcans were still confident, even though the days, carried on, that Manley and Rogers would come back for them. And they were right. Manley and Rogers did come back for them.
We told the families if they'd wait for us, we'd try to get through and get some relief. So the next day we went to work and killed 2 oxen and jerked the meat off 1 ox and a half. We had 22 pounds after it was dried, 11 pounds apiece. We put it in our knapsacks, shouldered our guns, and started out bidding them goodbye, not knowing whether we'd ever see 'em again. John Haney Rogers.
Manley and Rogers had hiked out the 13 or 14 days to a ranch. They had got a couple of horses and a one-eyed mule, had started back with provisions. The horses made it fine all the way until they got to the west side of the Panamints, which was probably within 30 miles of the families. And the terrain and those ravines going up the west side of the Panamints were just too much for the horses, and they had to be left. The one-eyed mule was, with a lot of coaxing and a lot of work on the part of Manley and Rogers, did make it through. To bring provisions to the families. And of course, they then gathered the families and escaped from Death Valley. It was that experience that we wanted as a group of hikers. We wanted to relive and retrace this historic trail. During the course of their exit from Death Valley and the families, Death Valley was named. There were a lot of wonderful things about this trail that make it a part of American history, and that's what we wanted to relive.
Captain Culverwell, they called him a captain. He really wasn't a captain. It was probably out of respect. Was an elderly man. I don't know his exact age, but he attempted to go with the Wades south out of Death Valley, and he couldn't keep up with them. So he turned around and tried to go back to Bennett's Long Camp, and he died en route. And when Manley and Rogers came back, they found him stretched out on the sand, dead. And he had only been dead a short time. We don't know exactly how many days. And of course, then they were fearful that all the party had left and that they may have missed them going out and that they too would have died. But Culverwell is the only person of the Death Valley contingent that died here in Death Valley. And that's how the name came about, on the basis of one death.
We had little trouble in packing up again in the morning and concluded to take a nearer route to the summit so as to more quickly reach the water holes where Rogers and I camped on our first trip over the country. This would be a hard, rocky road on its course, leading up a small rocky canyon, hard on the feet of the oxen, so they had to be constantly urged on, as they seemed very tender-footed. William Lewis Manley.
By pressing on till after darkness, the party made camp at the head of Warm Springs Canyon at an elevation of about 2,500 feet. The next morning, the party pushes on toward Arastra Spring, where the Bennetts and Arcans had spent the third night of their escape from the valley. As the group gains elevation, the views back toward Death Valley are spectacular.
We are probably how high, around 6,000 feet?
A little less than that.
A little less than 6,000 at Arastra Spring. Is this valley have a name?
This does not have a name, but it leads into Warm Springs Valley.
Okay.
Warm Springs Canyon.
Warm
Right.
Springs Canyon.
The Warm Springs Canyon, where we spent the night last night, was probably at what, 2,000, 3,000 feet maybe?
About that, yes.
Okay. Which we've come up here on our second day to Arastra. And from here on up to Manley Lookout. Is that Manley Lookout that is visible?
You can't see it. It's far to the south
Okay.
there.
Okay. Tell us about the significance of this in the 1850 trip out with the Bennett and Arcan family, and also how much different you think it is today than maybe it was then.
Well, in 1850, actually it was the winter of 49-50 when they came here, Manley and Rogers were the first white people to ever come to this site, and they were on their escape route going out for supplies. But when they came here, this was an active Indian camp, and they followed a very prominent Indian trail which has now been obliterated by the burros. And they came to this site, and there were probably baskets sitting around, and of course they may have thought that the Indians were still nearby, and so they were very fearful that the Indians would attack them. They had dinner here at the spring, and then they moved on up in the dark and slept without a fire that night for fear that the Indians would attack them.
And that was when Manley and Rogers went out.
When Manley and Rogers went out.
When they brought the families out, do you think the families came to this site?
Yes, the families came to this site, and it seems illogical that they would have come all the way up here because it is a long haul and it's out of the way. But they needed two things. They needed water and they needed forage for the oxen, because when they came here, there was lots of grass around, so they were able to let the oxen recoup here. And then Manley also wanted to take Bennett and Arcan to the top of the mountain and show them where the trail was in case he and Rogers died on the way out.
Gotcha. Let's talk a moment just about the different perspectives on this issue. John Southworth believes they did not go to the lookout. Does he hold that they came to Arastra?
I think he does, but that's still a little cloudy. He has not nailed himself down.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, if I was going to skip going up there, I would also skip coming here. I would stay down in that.
Most assuredly.
At Arastra Spring, around noon, the party divides. Determined to reach Manley Lookout at 7,500 feet for a view of the Sierra Nevada mountain range to the west. Elijah, LeRoy, Leonard, and Joel Franks, the project's field director and videographer, pack the camera gear and head for the top. The remaining members of the party, after scouting the area, move to the next ridge west, make camp, and wait for their return.
While waiting for the women, Bennett and Arcan wanted to go out and get a good view of the great snowy mountain I had told them so much about. The best point of view was near our camp, and I went with them. This place where we now stood was lower than the mountains either north or south, but were difficult to climb and gave a good view in almost every direction. And there, on the backbone of the ridge, we had a grand lookout. William Lewis Manley.
Well, when Manley and Rogers came to this high point here, they knew where they were. They had speculated that this might be the Sierra Nevada here. But as you can see over there, about 70 miles away, that's the Sierra Nevada. And those mountains are twice as tall as here. We're at about 7,400, and those peaks over there are about 14,000 feet. And they knew then they couldn't go down this canyon, which is called Pleasant Canyon. It has lots of water, and it is a very pleasant canyon. But that would have taken them far out of the course they wanted to go, which is down towards Los Angeles.
Let me ask, we've come up through Rogers Pass, and which is back over in here. And Arasta Spring is down below. And from a camp at Arasta, they walked to this point to see where they were.
Yes, there was Manley, Bennett, and Mr. Arcan all came up here. And they came up here not just to see the pleasant view, but so Manley could show them the road they were going to take, because they also had to assure the wives that they could make it safely.
I'm very sure that he took those people there. They needed to view the land ahead. And he certainly, it's such an impressive sight, even from Pleasant Canyon top, to look back over into Death Valley and across the country, that, as he says, they had crossed over for the last month and before they're going out to get supplies. So it's a very, as impressed as we are with that, he tops it off by them saying goodbye Death Valley, which of course Culverwell's death was fresh in their minds. They'd just come, they weren't even 2 days from burying him then, you see, so this is fresh on their mind.
Just as we were ready to leave and return to camp, we took off our hats, and then, overlooking the scene of so much trial, suffering, and death, spoke the thought uppermost, saying, "Goodbye, Death Valley," then faced away and made our steps toward camp. Many accounts have been given to the world as to the origin of the name, and by whom it was thus designated, but ours were the first visible footsteps, and we the party which named it the saddest and most dreadful name that came to us first from its memories. William Lewis Manley.
Well, it is recorded in many books and in popular literature that Mrs. Bennett named the valley and that she uttered those words, but that's not true at all, because Mrs. Bennett was back down at Arasta Spring. So it leaves the naming of Death Valley to 3 people, either Manley, Mr. Arcan, or Mr. Bennett, and I think Manley named it. He's a very humble person, and he just probably didn't want to call attention to himself and to grab that credit. He was not that type of person.
I think it might have been Mr. Arcan. Although Manley was a very humble person, I think he would have taken credit if he had actually said it himself. Bennett was not quite as sensitive a person as Arcan, and so that's why I choose Mr. Arcan.
The name generated it, it developed, and finally some years later, several years later, Manley in an interview with, I think I've got this story right, Manley in an interview with some newspaper man said, "We called it the Valley of Death." And the newspaper people picked it up, and from then on, it was Death Valley. It's a perfectly logical way. Manley says we turned and said goodbye. I don't think it happened quite that way, but I wouldn't argue with him. It makes a dramatic and a good story, and I'm strictly in favor of it. If he wants to claim it that way, why, fine.
As we manage national parks and try to tell the story of the park, the significance of it, whether it's about the pupfish or the bighorn sheep or about the Manley Trail or what, we feel an obligation to try to tell the most accurate story to the visitors, so that the visitors in coming to an area really get the facts and really understood what happened and have a very good, honest concept of it. So in that regard, it's important that we know the most accurate information we can. On the other hand, part of the excitement and romance are the unknown questions. And I think that adds a little extra excitement or challenge to it when you have differing opinions. I mean, that brings it to life in reality, and it puts you in the picture of helping to weigh these 2 different conflicting ideas. So I think that's a plus side.
Having enjoyed the majestic views of Manly Lookout, the group must now repack the camera gear and begin the descent. It is 4 in the afternoon and the sun will soon be setting. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, they finally reach camp about an hour after dark.
Looking back, I'm confident that we did the right thing. We wanted to go to Rogers Pass and to Manly Lookout, but there were times that afternoon that I was really unsure we'd done the right thing. It was a very tough climb with the camera gear, and it was definitely too late in the day.
Day 3, the weather is warm, and the party continued their travel over the Panamints and through Butte Valley to a descent out of the range through Redlands Canyon. After spending the night in Redlands Canyon just below Ox Jump Falls, the next morning, Gene and LeRoy Johnson describe how Manly and Rogers were able to get the One-Eyed Mule with the provisions for the families over this dry falls.
Well, in 1849, when they came up here with the One-Eyed Mule, they came to this waterfall and they couldn't get up over it.
This is when Manly and Rogers were coming back to the party in Death Valley.
Yes. And all the rock you see at the base of the fall, that has been put there since Manly and Rogers were here because a ramp was built up there by the military and the miners in order to get up to the spring. So when they got to that point, they had already abandoned their 2 horses just down the canyon, and they were very depressed here. And so they were determined, though, to find a route around. And he describes how they came down canyon about 50 feet, and then they went up on the south rim here, and we have searched this place many, many times, and we found what would be the most logical route. So if you're game, we'll try it. Well, every time we go back in there, we confirm to ourselves, to our own satisfaction, that that is where they push the oxen off. It's quite changed now than it was in 1849 and 50, because the ramp at the bottom with all those rocks that are there, built up by the military and by the miners so they could get their oxen and horses directly over the falls. But where we went around there, even though it was difficult, but Manly described it as difficult, you could see that where he said if you slipped and fell, you would go 50 feet down and probably kill yourself, and yet he described the falls as only being 10 foot high. I think he underestimated the falls, because if you physically today or mentally remove that rubble, it is taller than that. Probably it was more like 17 to 20 feet tall. And that would have begun to make sense, because if it was only 10 feet tall, they would have lowered the women and children directly over.
I think rather than the trail itself, my focus probably would fall immediately to the agony in their hearts of trying to get the animals back here. See, they had those horses, which the horses didn't make it. In fact, they left 2 of them just below Ox Jump Falls, and they were planning on the women and children riding those horses out. And the agony over whether they could get the families out, and losing those animals, and the tearing of their hearts and the tears for I was refreshed in my mind by rereading what Rogers said to Manly at Ox Jump Falls when they were trying to get the little mule over. It was so desperate, and of course the little mule was carrying the extra provisions, and they'd already lost the horses, knowing that they couldn't get them there. Manly's evidently crying, and Rogers says, "Come, Lewis, don't cry." And it just tears at my heart to think about. He was so concerned, they were, about the people, the families. And of course they thought that the Wades and others were also still depending on them. But
there's those children, and how are they going to get out? And here we're about to lose our little mule, and he says, Manley writes in his book that they were both crying, and he said if someone could have slipped up on the camp undetected, you'd have seen two mighty lonesome boys.
What type of men are strong enough and brave enough to think of others before themselves? What kind of women would leave comfort and security to face the uncertain hazards of the American West? What kind of people were these that survived Death Valley?
He was certainly an explorer type. He was certainly athletic because he could outwalk everybody. He walked up and down the hills on the sides, and he walked like 20 miles off the trail to find things. He was certainly of hero blood, or he never would have returned. That has to be one of the great heroic efforts. It just has to be one of the great acts of heroism in Western history. To walk 250 miles, nobody knew why they were there. There was no reason to go back, except they were honest. They had a conscience. I mean, it was a tremendous act of heroism. Walk 250 miles through god-awful country, turn right around and walk back again, just to show them the trail, and then to bring them out.
Well, of course, when you read, I think he was 29 years old, fairly young. I would say these men were in their 20s. And I wonder if in the face of this emergency situation, that they didn't but show the best of their raising, if you will. I don't know that. When we're thrown into unusual circumstance, I think somehow maybe the best of us shows up somehow instead of the worst.
That he was the first to lead a wagon train safely through Death Valley. Therefore, I believe it's a story which we all need to hear, and it was a heroic effort. I don't believe he felt a hero. I think he did what he felt was right, but it was a heroic struggle which they made, and their effort was repaid by being able to go to safety, to find the ranch in Southern California.
So this man was generous, very compassionate. He knew once they got into Death Valley that he could get out. He had there was no question but what he could get out. But he knew the families couldn't get out without his help. So he was willing to risk his life to go out and return to save these people. And this kind of generosity makes this man a real hero, then and today.
180 pounds, overshadowing Lewis, as he called him, his friend, a tough Tennessean, a volunteer state, a man ready to be counted on.
He was a lanky Tennessean, all right, with little or no education, no interest in storytelling, but he was a frontiersman, and he could walk right along with William Manley. The two were great friends. They got along well together just because John Rogers doesn't appear too much in the literature does not detract from his heroic efforts. He was just as responsible and just as important as Manly was, but Manly was the storyteller and he put it on paper and Manly gets the credit. The two of them did the work.
I think of all the people, I would want to be a lot like John Rogers. To me, even though we know very little about him, I think he was a giant of a man.
It was a sample of what was going on then. There were a lot of women who wanted very much to go west, but there were far more who went because their husbands were going, and they had no choice in the matter. We don't know what the situation was with the Arcans or the Bennetts in this case, but they were there. They had no choice at this point except to get out and try to be alive and get their children out. It was very traumatic because little Martha had been very sick in Death Valley and they thought she was going to die. She was so weak she could not walk, where before she'd been all over just like a little fairy. So she had to ride in the pocket, and it was cramped, and the children were hungry and they were thirsty and they were uncomfortable, and so they were crying for help and water and such. So there was a lot of stopping and fixing that had to go on, and this slowed them up, of course, too.
I believe that we see that adversity usually brings out the best in people. Now, I'm an optimist, of course. There were dozens of other people in this same circumstance. None of them stayed to help the women and the children. These fine young men, the Mississippi Boys, the Bug Smashers, the Sand Walkers, the Breyer's party. Breyer did an admirable job also. But these people just walked right off and left the responsibility to Manly and Rogers. And while I say it brings out the best, the very finest of the best, I think, is displayed in Manly and Rogers, isn't it?
Out of the canyon, the One-Eyed Mule Party is now splintered into small groups to cross the Salt Flats and Panamint Valley.
We hurried on as rapidly as possible so as to get into the Jayhawkers' beaten train, which would be a little easier to follow. When we reached the lowest part of the valley, we had to turn south to get around a little slow-running stream of salt water that moved north and emptied into Salt Lake. No source of the stream could be seen from this point, but when we reached a point where we could cross, we had a smooth, hard clay bed to march over. It seemed to have been, someday, a bed of mortar, but now baked hard, and the hoofs of the oxen dented into it no more than half an inch. William Lewis Manly.
At this historical marker, the camera crew once again joins the party on foot to cross the slates.
This day's walk was the hardest one yet, and probably the longest one of the whole journey. But there was no other place where we could find a place large enough to make a camp and free enough of rocks so that a bed could be made. William Lewis Manly.
Night 4 at the Silent Sepulchre, it begins to rain. Day 5, the weather is bad.
Well, this is the site where Reverend Breyer and his family came and camped. And then when Manly and Rogers came out, they had started up the ridge, but they were so desperate for water, they knew they couldn't find it on the ridge top. So they dropped down into the canyon and they found the tracks of the Jayhawkers. He said the Jayhawkers, it was actually the Breyer mess. And they followed him up here, and he says in his book, they found where they dug for water, but they found none. What had happened was the briars had depleted all the water in these little tanahas or tanks.
When Manley and Rogers returned to Death Valley, the only people still waiting was Mr. and Miss Bennett and their 3 children, George, Melissa, and Martha, and the Arcans with their 1 son, Charlie. So there were 5 Bennetts, 3 Arcans, and Manley and Rogers made up the party of 10 that were now escaping Death Valley together. They crossed the Panamints, crossed the Panamint Valley, and into the Slate Range. They picked up the trail of some of the other 49ers who had already escaped Death Valley on foot. Now, when Manley and Rogers had gone out for provisions, they followed that same trail, and so they were aware of the fact that the Briar mess, which included Reverend Briar and his family and a few others that were associated, they were aware that that's the way they had escaped and gone through the Slate Range. In fact, Manley and Rogers found the body of Father Fish on the east side of the Slates, and it was on the west side of the Slates that Mr. Isham, who was traveling with the Briar mess, had died also.
Well, it's about here, fellas, that old Father Fish was about ready to give out, and he struggled up this last incline here. And of course, as we found out below, they were following an Indian trail, because we found that Indian cave and the rock alignment, and we could see where an ancient spring was. No, we don't know how old these Indian sites were, but very ancient, because that spring has been dry for many years. Of course, when the 49ers came through here, they didn't have the overcast and rain like we have today. But it's about in this spot where old Father Fish breathed his last. Well, I'm glad I made it here.
Welcome, welcome.
And I didn't have an ox to hold on to its tail. Well, when Reverend Briar's group left the Silent Sepulchre, and they went up canyon a short ways, and they turned up the side draw to the sand area where the wind blown. He describes it as wind-blown sand. Actually, those were those sandy areas, decomposed granite, were laid down hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably. But Father Fish was tired and worn out, and he didn't know, of course, he was near death. And when he went up there, he had to grab on the tail of an oxen, and the oxen helped pull him to the top, and he probably went a short way, and there he died. And it was such hard ground and very little rocks around to bury him, so they left him right there exposed. And I'm sure they said a few words over him. They did try to revive him. They tried to give him water, but he couldn't drink. And he was just laid to rest right there, because Manley tells about coming back there 10 years later and still being able to see his bones there in the sun.
Over the Slates and across Cyril's Valley to Indian Joe Springs, the 5th and final day is completed in the ever-continuing rain.
Well, unless we have knowledge of and appreciation of the suffering that people went through to settle California and to bring people out here, and we just need to have some knowledge of our roots, even though I'm not related to them, but we've been very fortunate in finding direct relatives of Manley. I think it's very important that we know where we came from, and that gives us a better insight on where we're going.
So I have the sense of feeling that when I go from the scene, that this story has gripped someone else's heart, maybe in a better way because of what little we've contributed. So that's rewarding.
Oh, this is American history. This is adventure, that kind that doesn't exist anymore. We can't do this anymore. Young man go west days are over. We've come to the Pacific Ocean and there's no place to go. This is a history that will never be repeated, and it's the last thing we have to hang on to. This story will be interesting forever.
Everyone, really everyone, ought to hike some history. The things you learn about the history are absolutely fascinating. You have a better feel for why that was important to America's history, and in this case, certainly important to California's history. And I really think you come away with not only understanding the people that you spend time with better, but you understand yourself a lot better as well.
This story is not meant to be sensational, but a plain, unvarnished tale of truth. Some parts hard and very sad. I have told it in the plainest, briefest way, with nothing exaggerated or overdone. Those who travel over the same or similar routes are capable of passing a just opinion of the story. William Lewis Manley.
Although the days of 1849 and the discovery of a way to escape Death Valley are gone, the days of discovering America and its history aren't. So read a book, get a map, get in condition, and go hike some real history. I'm Gene Evans, and it's been a pleasure.
Hello, folks. My name is Elijah Collard, and I'm the producer of this documentary. I wanted to give you just a little more insight into a couple of things about the documentary. It was 1991, spring. I had the idea of creating a series of documentaries around hiking history, hiking a significant part of America's past. However, it was my father who actually gave the inspiration for this particular film. My father had pastored a church in Trona, California, up on the high desert, fallen in love with the history of the area, read William Lewis Manley's book, Death Valley in '49, and followed that up by reading LeRoy and Gene Johnson's book on the Death Valley Escape Trail. He was fascinated with the story from the beginning, and it began a number of years of passion for the story. He inspired me to put together the idea of having a documentary of us actually hiking the first portion, the first 60 miles of this trail. We did so in February of 1992. Dad was living in Missouri. I was working and living in Tennessee, where I continue to reside. We put the project together, went out west, and spent a month and hiked the trail, shot the footage. Unfortunately, my father was tragically killed 4 months later in a motorcycle accident on his way to Alaska. But the inspiration of the story remains, and I am thankful to have finally finished the project. Let me give you some insight into a couple of things, though, that I think are important. One is that my father's passion for the trail led him to start the Death Valley Escape Trail Conference. His idea was that people would band together and would actually help preserve the history of certain sections of the trail. And to that end, my father, from 1988 to 1992, the year of his death, made historical markers that he not only handcrafted but then erected on the trail with the help of a number of friends living in the area. These markers, the first of which was the Fish Canyon marker. It's As you enter into Fish Canyon, it's accessible by four-wheel drive. It tells the story, a bit of the story of Fish Canyon. Later on, he made a marker for the Father Fish death site. It is up from Fish Canyon as you go up the windrows of sand, where they found, where William Lewis Manley and John Rogers actually found the body of Father Fish, who had expired while he was traveling with the Reverend Breyer group. Later, my dad made the Silent Sepulchre marker, which is in Fish Canyon. And the final marker that he crafted was the Rogers Pass marker. The Rogers Pass marker is in the Panamint Mountain Range on the trail. It's accessible up through Ballarat and up Pleasant Canyon. It was near the site where the party actually named Death Valley. A couple of other signs that you might find interesting is you will also find in Fish Canyon a memorial marker to my father, Leonard Collard. It was crafted by my brother, Aaron Collard, and we erected it in February of 1993 after our father's death. Another beautiful marker, and it's near the Silent Sepulchre marker. Also, if you're traveling the road from Trona to Death Valley, you'll pass the little ghost town of Ballarat that's a few miles off the road. As you pass that area, you'll see a sign there. It's another sign that was crafted by my father, giving information about the ghost town of Ballarat. So when you're in the area, you'll know a little more about what all my father has contributed to preserving the history of not only the area, but the Death Valley Escape Trail in particular. I want to thank all the people who worked on the project. Many, many thanks, too many to mention here. Particularly want to thank LeRoy and Gene Johnson, who 20 plus years ago took vacation and came and spent time hiking on the trail and sharing their valuable information with us. Great time, and I appreciate their help so very much. Also appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so very, very much.
I'm going down in Death Valley on the tombstones and dry bones. I'm going down in Death Valley on the tombstones and dry bones. I'm like a sheep out on the fold. Don't you know I'm dying all alone? Oh, yes, I am. Death Valley gonna be my home.